look back at the launch of these two consoles, it wasn't long after launch that Saturn gained a reputation for inferior 3D graphics, but I think many have forgotten exactly why this line of thinking became so prevalent. After all, anyone following the Saturn would know that the system did receive some exceptional 3D games, and we'll see it in this video, with some of them exceeding what PlayStation could achieve. But unfortunately, first impressions often color the larger perception. Now, I've talked about Ridge Racer and Daytona USA before, but I want to reiterate that this is really the first showdown which tilted the public opinion in favor of PlayStation. Ridge Racer is simply a smoother game, running at 30 frames per second versus Daytona's 20, and there's less distracting pop-in and graphical anomalies on top of it. Daytona also ran on what was then the most powerful arcade board available, making such a transition even more difficult. But within the first year or two, Sega released games such as the seminal Sega Rally Championship, the beautiful Panzer Dragoon 2, and the stunning Virtua Fighter 2, which came surprisingly close to the arcade original. These helped prove that Sega's machine had plenty of gas left in the tank. Even third parties would begin to push Sega's machine in interesting ways that showcased its true potential. Of course, the PlayStation certainly didn't sit still either, and would continue to receive the lion's share of support over its lifetime, with many of its later generation titles really pushing the limits of what it could achieve. So when comparing the games released on both platforms, it's important to keep certain things in mind then. Firstly, the lead platform matters a lot. Games which started life on PlayStation, for instance, often fared a lot worse on Sega's console due to the different architecture, but the reverse is also true. Then there's the matter of 2D games versus 3D games. Saturn had a reputation for superior 2D graphics, while PlayStation was known for 3D, but there are certainly some surprises in store as well. It's important to keep this in mind as we proceed. So let's begin with our first part, tackling driving games across both Saturn and PlayStation. Which console comes out on top in the multi-platform racing war? Well, let's find out. With the shift to fully 3D graphics, racing game enthusiasts were finally served in the home console space, and both Saturn and PlayStation have a huge range of amazing exclusive racing games. But when it comes to multi-platform releases, things are a little skewed. PlayStation especially shines thanks to the Ridge Racer series, Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, and so many others, including hidden gems like the 60 FPS Motorhead from DICE. Saturn, of course, had Sega Rally Championship, the quirky Sonic R, and more. But there were some shared titles between them, which is our topic for today. The first is a key title for the original PlayStation, launching alongside the system in Europe and created by the then newly Sony acquired Psygnosis. Wipeout made a huge splash on the system worldwide. Wipeout embraced the counterculture that was bubbling up in the UK at the time. The rise of electronic music, dance parties, raves, and more. Psygnosis tapped directly into this while developing Wipeout, creating a fictional racing league from the future, paired with the energy and music that you could hear emanating from the local club. Wipeout made a strong impression on anyone lucky enough to play it at the time, and very likely helped sell quite a few PlayStations. Yet despite Sony ownership, Wipeout was not an exclusive. It received a near concurrent release on PC, and just a few months later, a port to Sega Saturn. The Saturn port was handled by Tantalus, the same company that recently released the Switch conversion of Luigi's Mansion 2. This was their third game. Wipeout for Sega Saturn is an interesting case. It was great to receive an acclaimed title like this in Sega's machine, but at the same time, the port has serious technical limitations that may have ultimately harmed the system's image at a time when it had a lot to prove. It's obvious right away when you compare the two. The frame rate is cut down from 30 frames per second to just 20 FPS with mild frame time spikes. It's a significant loss in performance compared to the PlayStation original, and it negatively impacts the entire experience. It also feeds that narrative that the Saturn is weak when it comes to 3D graphics. In reality, this is more than likely related to the difficulty in developing for Saturn that was faced early on, especially by Western studios. developer support just wasn't where it needed to be, and making games for the system was really tough at the time. This is emphasized by other issues throughout. All transparency effects are replaced with dithered mesh transparency instead, which the Saturn kinda became known for, while the distant background graphics, the mountain, sky, etc., are replaced with a layer rendered by VDP2, which is of course Saturn's second video display processor, which can handle traditional tile-mapped graphics and is put to great use in many other titles. Via emulation, we can look at the game running in wireframe mode on PS1. You can see here that the sky itself is a dome that encircles the entire racetrack. The sky texture is simply mapped onto this dome, and that's why its perspective shifts as you move around the environment. VDP2 does a good job on Saturn, but it does feel a little more flat in comparison. Texture quality also takes a hit. The Saturn version seems to use a lower color depth for its textures, reducing the amount of visible detail per surface. Talking with folks over on the Sega Saturn Shiro Discord though, this change could come down to a limitation of the Saturn itself. Essentially, Saturn cannot do texture coordinates, so each texture has to be its own unique image, which of course requires more VRAM. The PlayStation game seems to use 8 bits per pixel for its textures, so to save space, many Saturn ports had to resort to 4 bits per pixel textures, effectively bit crushing them in the process. The colors were defined by a color lookup table then. The higher color detail in the PlayStation version's textures doesn't seem to have been possible on Saturn. But that's not the only point of conversion they had to worry about, there's also the geometry itself. If we turn on the wireframe mode, it sort of reveals the underlying construction of the game world. Note that the preferred polygonal primitive hadn't yet been established as of the early 90s, and the two consoles differ in how they transform and display geometry. PlayStation uses triangles, of course, while Saturn uses quads. The thing is, Sony's machine also uses affine texture mapping, meaning that UV coordinates are determined using only X and Y positions, but not depth or Z. This is the source of PlayStation's visible distortion on textures. To improve the situation then, developers would subdivide terrain geometry based on camera distance so that areas near the player can use more triangles to minimize warping. Viewing the two side by side, you can see how PlayStation's triangles stack up against the quad-based Saturn. I love visualizations like this. But yeah, suffice to say, Wipeout was one of the most important games early on in the PlayStation's life, and the Saturn port really doesn't do it justice. But compared to some of the stuff we'll look at later in this video, it's not so bad. But let's go ahead and jump forward in time, because this is not the last time that we'd see a Wipeout game grace Sega's machine. You see, the sequel, Wipeout XL, or Wipeout 2097 as it's known in Europe, also received a tantalus port for Sega Saturn, but only in Japan and Europe. On PlayStation, it's considered an amazing sequel that takes everything people love about the original and expands it. The new tracks are excellent, the soundtrack even better, and the visuals further improved. It's quite a game to behold, and on PlayStation, it even manages to hum along at a nice smooth 30 frames per second. The Saturn version, however, has issues. Sega of America originally sought to publish this game themselves in the West, but as specified in the leaked fiscal year 97 documents, they had complaints with the various Psygnosis ports that were in the works for Saturn, but it seems like they never actually managed to improve the situation, and thus the port was not released. Here's the thing though, the reviews of this era seem to suggest that 2097 on Saturn was actually improved over the original Wipeout conversion, but after testing it myself, I'm not actually sure this is true. Essentially, it shares all the same problems as the original conversion of Wipeout. The lack of transparencies is even more obvious this time around as they use more of them on PlayStation, and the frame rate is even less stable. It still targets 20 frames per second, but there's random inconsistencies in the frame time graph that further reduce fluidity, so it just feels worse. The Saturn versions of these games just aren't quite good enough, though still playable if it's the only option you had. It just makes a bad impression in comparison to the PlayStation. While we're talking Psygnosis though, it should be noted that Wipeout wasn't the only Psygnosis racing game to make the jump. Destruction Derby also received a Saturn conversion, and despite being advertised in American magazines, this game only shipped in Japan and Europe, much like Wipeout 2097/XL. The PlayStation original is another very early game for the system, notable for its destruction and physics. The tracks are packed with polygonal racers, all capable of slamming into one another while causing visible damage to the car bodies. It's a lot of fun and runs at a pretty stable 30 frames per second most of the time. This was definitely an impressive showpiece for the PlayStation early on. However, much like Wipeout, Saturn Derby runs at just 20 frames per second and features a reduction in visual detail and draw distance, but unlike Wipeout, it can and does drop as low as 15 frames per second in busy sequences. More so than Wipeout, this one feels pretty laggy and difficult to play compared to the PlayStation original, so it's no surprise that Sega of America turned it down as well. What's interesting about this one is that the game's development team seemingly made good use of Saturn's second video display processor. Essentially, they used two different VDP2 layers to simulate the ground and the sky. Since the game uses flat terrain, it's a perfect option, as this reduces the total number of polygons needed for rendering the game. So they basically built the track to run on top of the VDP2 floor. However, that floor is not especially stable and can give the impression that it's sort of swimming beneath the road surface. The track itself, cars, surroundings, and all that all rely on polygons, and again, given its release time frame, it also doesn't likely leverage the multi-CPU architecture of Saturn, which is something a lot of Western devs struggled with at the time, so given all that, it's not really surprising that it runs a lot worse. Despite that, Destruction Derby 2 was being planned for Saturn, with Probe Entertainment even starting work on it, but by this point, Perfect 10, the publisher, had given up on Saturn entirely and the conversion was scrapped.